Hi, my name is Nicole, and today I'm going to talk about violence in juvenile detention centers. I was given 4 questions to address for this prompt, and they are: what is the role of violence in juvenile detention centers? Who are the perpetrators? Why is violence so common in juvenile detention centers? And how might this impact the future behavior of juveniles who spend time in detention centers? And I think in order to understand the role that violence plays in youth detention centers, we have to first determine, what is the goal of detaining our youth? Is it deterrence, retribution, incapacitation, or rehabilitation? There's really not many federal guidelines or regulations when it comes to detaining our youth, so these decisions are typically made on the state and county levels. But a recent survey showed that a majority of victims of crime believe that the goal should be rehabilitation. So we already know that violence is present in detention centers, and with that in mind, we can determine that even though many people feel that rehabilitation should be the goal of our systems, it remains the only option that cannot be satisfied. Violence is only conducive to the other 3 options. So if that's true, then violence plays the role of enforcement. It's a method of control. And who's perpetrating this violence? How are they doing it? Well, the violence that exists inside detention centers exists on many levels, and it can be seen in physical, sexual, psychological, emotional abuse, also manifests as severe neglect. This happens between kids, this happens between staff and kids and staff, and it's a real problem, especially considering that most of these kids are coming in with a history of trauma. And if they didn't already have a history of trauma, they're going to have one once they are released. But if we take a look at the larger picture, it becomes a little less easy to blame the kids or the family or even the staff in some cases. And here's why. The average cost of juvenile detention per day is $547. For each kid. That's the average from all 50 states. Just for a comparison, it's only $3.55 a day to go to your local community college. That includes tuition and fees. To go to our most expensive university, which right now is Stanford, that's $204 a day. That's out-of-state tuition for a California university, room and board, everything. And then we look at the other end of the spectrum, and psychiatric care is crazy expensive, $952 a day on average, and that's for a family that has insurance. And if you're one of the fortunate few and your family can afford to pay cash and has it laying around, you can go to a luxury rehab for about $6,000 a day. So we can see from the disparities here that there's only a small percentage of youth in our nation that are economically privileged enough to be nurtured and rehabilitated. Because really, who can afford that? The median household income for a white family works out to about $208 a day before tax. For a black family, it's significantly lower, about $124 a day before tax. And juvenile detention officers who are spending day and night with these kids, they're clearing about $75 a day before tax. So there's some real problems with this system. And there's not a whole lot of training that goes into being one of these officers. The turnover rate is really high. You only need to have a high school diploma or a GED, be at least 21 years old, and have no felony convictions. Yet a lot of people who could make these changes are living really well. We have the founder and CEO of GeoCorp, which runs a lot of institutions for both youth and adult around the world. And though we've started to phase out these private systems, this guy's still doing pretty well. He's clearing over $15,000 a day. We have our representatives in the House and the Senate, and they're making close to $500 a day on top of healthcare and other benefits, money from lobbyists. State governors are also doing okay. And even the prison warden is doing pretty well, doing better than a lot of the rest of us. So aside from all this, there's also private companies that bid on contracts, and they provide phone service, food service, laundry service. Sometimes a phone call for just 15 minutes can cost $25. So many of these kids also become completely isolated from their families. Yet we silently pay our tax dollars to fund these atrocities. So who is committing the violence? I mean, is it all of us? I don't know. We're voting for these people or we're not voting for them, but either way, there hasn't been any real change. The United Nations actually issued a guidance report, and they called out the US for having the highest rate of incarceration for juveniles or adults, and being the only nation that still allows juveniles to receive sentences that amount to life in prison. And that's to say that even though we've abolished the death penalty for juveniles recently, and even more recently abolished life sentences, we still allow the stacking of sentences that amount to life in prison for juveniles. According to the United Nations report, this is a quote, "We're depriving our children of their right to life, survival, and development." And it can really, I mean, it goes back for so long, but the evolution of zero tolerance policies, both in school and public policies, that has stemmed from this system of fear and desire to control, especially post 9/11, we've really seen like this uptick and this funneling of kids into the system. And while overall juvenile detention rates have gone down over the past 20 years, the disproportionate number of minorities being incarcerated has continued to rise. So I think also one of the things that we've seen increasingly, like over the past 30 years, when you talk about a system of class and race control, which is where the violence comes in, and we see it as a solution for everything in this country domestically. It seems to be prison for the kids, prison for the adults. We may not have public housing for the poor, and we've got prisons. Governor Cuomo even used HUD funds one year from low-income housing to build prisons, which in this really disgusting way has become the new low-income housing. And as you might have guessed, violence and neglect is completely ineffective when it comes to preventing crime. And especially when we're considering juvenile recidivism is at 65%. And that number increases if we talk to the adult population who's incarcerated, because 85% of them have been incarcerated as a juvenile. And the estimated lifetime burden, which is loss of tax revenue, potential income that could have been earned by these people, contributions to their communities, things like that, comes out to about $4.7 trillion. And that was just across the cohort of a study of youth in 2011 of the missed opportunity there. So we not only spend like an exorbitant amount to incapacitate these kids, but we're also setting them up for failure in the future. It means money spent on incarceration and fewer individuals participating in our economy. So why is this violence so common? Because it's a cycle. We keep feeding kids into this system in which violence is the only possible outcome. It's the only thing that can happen in these places. So what kind of impact is that going to have on their future behavior? It doesn't take much to know that it's going to be bad, right? So kids go through like this second window of opportunity, and that begins around the time of puberty, typically around 10 or 12 years old. There's a lot of pruning that goes on in our brain where we're getting rid of all these dead branch neurons that we don't need anymore, and we're myelinating the ones that we do. So they're going to become more efficient. If a child is used to, surviving or acting a certain way to survive in life, those are the connections in their brain that are really going to be solidified because they need to be more effective. And that's what happens during this time period. It's really about experience. And teens have like a lack of ability compared to adults to interpret emotion on faces, to make good decisions. Their limbic system, their amygdala in particular, is often triggered in situations, which is the fight or flight mechanism. They have this response before it gets to the prefrontal cortex, because the prefrontal cortex, which does the logic and reasoning, isn't fully developed yet. So they don't often have the ability to fully think through what they're doing. And if we add in trauma, substance use, any of these things, it becomes even murkier. The point being that the majority of violent offenses are committed within this age group. So the choice is kind of ours whether or not we teach people the skills that are needed to lead a healthy lifestyle, or just throw them in cages like animals. But both are going to have a really lasting impact, and the price of incarceration is high. We're actually hardwiring kids into criminals. So I'm going to show you two separate examples of a restraint device, an actual restraint device that's used in some places, and it's called the wrap. And there's also a helmet that goes with it, which has in both examples a little face drawn on it. The helmet's to block spit. I don't know what to say about this, so I had to show it because I saw it and I was disgusted. And it's just a few of the ways that we continue to basically just shit all over our most vulnerable population and pretend like we're throwing confetti at it. I mean, can you imagine walking into an animal shelter and seeing any of the animals treated this way? It's illegal. We can't do that to animals. But here we are. Here we are. These are actual images, obviously photoshopped for drama, but actual images of the way that we treat our kids in this country. So that's all I have. I hope I was able to answer your questions. Yeah, thanks for listening.